Hi, everybody. I'm Michelle Feltus. I'm one of the Global Emergency Medicine faculty at Stanford University. Thank you for joining us today. I'm the Global Emergency Medicine Fellowship co-director at Stanford, and I am also the immediate past chair for the Global Emergency Medicine Fellowship Consortium. I did just like a little bit about past experiences. I did med school at WashU in St. Louis, and then did residency at GW in Washington, D.C. When I was a resident, I did two rotations abroad, both in India. As a second year, I did an ophthalmology elective, and then as a fourth year, I taught as part of GW's master's work with helping teach the master's programs in India for EM training. As a fellow, I worked a lot in Myanmar. My other academic interest is in medical education. So when I was a fellow, I did a 2-year fellowship at Stanford and did got a master's degree in medical education from USC, and then stayed on as faculty at Stanford. Um, Currently, my work right now is in ultrasound training in Rwanda, with building a curriculum and designing a QA project, or kind of getting a QA component to that ultrasound project in Rwanda. All right.
Hey guys, my name is Priya Aramaganathan. I'm a current second year Global Emergency Medicine Fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm currently completing my master's in public health as a part of that process. And I grew up in West Virginia. I did my med school and residency training at West Virginia University. It is a 3-year program, and with no formal global emergency medicine faculty or department there. So I had to kind of make my own global emergency medicine experience while I was working through my applications. And in residency, I ended up doing an internship with Child Family Health International virtually as I did residency during COVID. And I also did a lot of telestroke work through my university in focused on rural underserved areas that I felt had a lot of applications to underserved areas globally as well. So even with those limitations, I think that you can still build a good application for global emergency medicine. And currently, my fellowship work, there's a variety of places where I work, but I mainly work in Pakistan as well as Botswana as core and visiting faculty. And very happy to share my experiences about the fellowship program so far.
Thank you, Priya. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about what global EM fellowships can look like. This is something that has a wide variety in programs across the country, and in Canada. Um, Most of them are 1 or 2 years. If you're doing a 2-year fellowship, most programs would want you to do an advanced degree unless you already have an advanced degree. So if you got an MPH as part of medical school, you may not need to do an advanced degree, even if you do a 2-year program, but most would encourage that. Um, the types of fellowships can vary widely in their focus. So, for instance, at Stanford, our group focuses a lot on more systems building. So, a lot of capacity development. My personal work is in education, but that can also be triage systems, EMS development, things like that. But a lot of other programs will focus more on the humanitarian or refugee area. And some programs will kind of overlap. Programs will have different areas around the world that they focus on. So some programs will work in 1 or 2 sites intensely for many, many years. Other programs will have multiple sites that kind of change over time. So for instance, Stanford, we've been working in India for a very long time, working in EMS, but we also have projects ongoing in Rwanda and Sri Lanka and Kenya. And that kind of varies with time. But that it's something that is very program specific. Something you're going to notice is I'm going to talk a lot about this is a lot about finding the right fit. And that includes figuring out having at least some idea of what you're interested in. Whether it's more the capacity development, it's more the humanitarian response. Having a little bit of an idea of that when you're picking the fellowship will help you find the right fellowship for you for this.
I definitely agree and echo those sentiments. Just to speak a little bit more about the program at Penn, it is a 2-year fellowship program. You do get your master's in public health as a part of that program. Although, if you're already coming in with your MPH, you can decide to do a different master's. We can work with you on that. And then in terms of travel, as long as you meet your clinical requirement of 32 shifts in a 4-month period, which averages out to about 8 shifts per month, you can travel as much as you want. So fellows typically travel about every 6 to 8 months, whether that's doing a project or going to a conference or whatever else you may want to do with that travel time. And we do have that travel funded by our Center for Global Health. And definitely, I think when you are applying for fellowship programs, that you should focus on figuring out what is a good fit for you and not just applying to every program because you can. The global emergency medicine community is small. We all end up working a lot together, anyways, at the end of the day, and you'll run into each other during the fellowship process. So just focus on picking a place that aligns well with your interests, whether, again, that's education, research, humanitarian and disaster response. And you can really get a good sense of a program's mission and purpose by looking at the SAEM Global Emergency Medicine Fellowship Consortium's website and looking at each program individually, what projects they have going on, and even reaching out to different programs if you want to find out more about their projects. And I encourage you to see if how you can find ways to get involved in those projects too, if you're really interested in seeing if it's a good fit for you.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the fellowship directors are very used to getting like the equivalent of like a cold email, being like, "Hey, I'm interested in this project. Like, would you have time to chat with me about it?" From residents from other institutions. And we know that there are people that are working in residencies that don't have global EM faculty. And so if there's a way to get you involved, that's something that and you are reaching out to us and following through on emails back to us. This is something where we will not be chasing you down to help like get you to participate. But if you are very proactive about wanting to be a part of a project, and like very interested, very engaged, those are people that we can get involved in our projects, even if you're not at our institution. Um, Stanford is just a little bit about the specific Stanford's program. Stanford, our residency is a 4-year residency, and our chair has decided that we are only accepting applications for only accepting fellows that have completed either a 4-year residency or did 3 years of residency and 1 year of something else. So that could be somebody who started off as a surgery resident and then switched into EM and did 3 years of EM. Or it could be somebody who finished residency, worked clinically for a while, and is coming back to fellowship. We're one of the few programs that does that. And it's something that I'm not a big fan of that particular rule. I think there would be other things we could do about having a graduate from a 3-year program to work with our residents. But that's a chair level decision that we can't change. And so that's just it. That's just something. All of our fellows are now 2-year fellows as well. Like we have to do a 2-year fellowship. That's something our chair also decided. But it does mean that everybody can also get an advanced degree. We're pretty flexible. We don't actually, even if you don't have an MPH, you can get a different degree. So like I did the med ed degree. It just has to be something that makes sense for what you want to do with your career. So it is something where we do have funding available for the advanced degree. I think most programs that are 2 years with with that option often have some type of funding available to at least partially cover the advanced degree. But that is something important to clarify. So we have a certain amount of funding available. It ends up being 50,000 over 2 years. So that covers most like MPHs, most of those kinds of programs. It does not cover something like an MBA very well. A lot of MBAs are very expensive. So that's just something to consider when you're deciding what type of advanced degree you would want. The other thing is the advanced degrees, you also want to think about how much time you're spending in person versus travel. And this is especially important for Global EM Fellowship. Our fellows travel can vary widely. So it can be something where somebody's traveling, they don't travel very much for the first 6 months, and then they're traveling 2 weeks on a 2 week trip, like 3 or 4 times in 6 months. And our clinical load is 8 shifts a month, 8 hour shifts a month, but it's averaged over the year. And so that means that if, say, you're not traveling very much at the beginning of fellowship because you're studying for boards, then you can start stacking some shifts and build up some shift credit, and then not work as much clinically the months that you're traveling a lot. Um, that's something that varies according to program. I think a lot of programs will have something where it's like either a 4 month time, 6 month time, a year time, like some amount of time where you have to get your shifts in that amount of time, but it doesn't have to be the exact same number of shifts every month. There's often a lot of flexibility with that part. The exact number of shifts a month is also going to vary based on program. I think 6 to 8 is very common. I personally, as a new grad, I remember thinking about how I would be uncomfortable solidifying my skills as an attending with fewer than 6 shifts a month. I feel like you need a good amount of time as an attending to actually feel comfortable being an attending, to like learn that comfort. So that's also just something to keep in mind um, when you're thinking about different programs for this. I think Priya, do you want to talk about how you found the right fellowship? Like what you're like other things you might be looking for?
Yeah. So I knew going into the fellowship application process that education was more of my interest and curriculum building. I had taken a couple of curriculum building, basically like courses throughout residency. That was something that interested me a lot. I was very involved as chief resident in residency in helping to educate some of the residents and med students. So that was something that I could see myself fulfilling in a global capacity. And so when I was looking at fellowships, I really focused on programs that aligned well with those interests. And with Penn, what really stood out to me was the certificate program in emergency medicine that we have in Pakistan, where we're helping to train providers who are not emergency medicine residency trained, but who are working in emergency settings, helping them to gain the foundational skills in emergency care so that they can bring high quality care to their communities. And so that was something that really stood out to me and that I was able to speak upon during my interviews and also throughout the application process. So definitely encourage people to take a look and see what really speaks to them when they're looking at programs.
Yeah, I think at the towards the end of this, I'll show you some of the websites we're talking about. Um, I think it's also important to play on the institutional website for each of these programs to also see what else is going on. You also want to try to get a sense of how many faculty they have. A place that has one or two faculty is going to be a very different experience than a place with 8 or 10 global EM faculty. And it's something that it doesn't mean that a place that only has one or two faculty is the wrong place for a fellow. It means that what you're doing should be what you're interested in should be well aligned with the interests of those faculty. When you have a larger number of faculty, you may be like, this person does one thing that's cool, and I like this thing that another person does that's cool, but you don't, it may not have to be quite as much of an overlap. But if you have two people that you're working with, you need to make sure that those people are doing things that you're interested in for that. Um, I think another thing for the Wright Fellowship is also you do still spend like a certain number of shifts a year working clinically in your home institution in their ED. And it is something where if you are going to absolutely hate that clinical environment, that is probably not a good fit. Um, it's 8 shifts a month may not sound as bad when you're talking comparing that to a resident schedule, but when you're also adding in fellowship activities and you're adding in master's learning and all of that, studying for boards and trying to have a life, you don't want to spend 8 shifts a month, as an example, miserable. So if your passion is working in underserved like city emergency departments, you do not want to go to the rural or suburban site. You want to make sure you're still doing clinical care that you find rewarding as much as you can.
Yeah. Another thing that I think is important to think about, especially being a fresh attending, gaining those skills and that confidence working on your own. Another thing that I personally looked at was making sure that whatever program I was applying for also had a split between academic and community sites as well, so that I could keep my skills fresh by working a certain number of community shift hours as well. And also looking at the travel breakdown, how often the fellows actually get to travel, how much of their travels are funded by the program. Those details I thought were important too when applying.
The financial part is definitely important, and a lot of programs aren't going to guarantee funding for travel, but they'll say these are grants that we almost always get for fellows. Or they'll say like this project is fully funded, this project isn't, but you do have enough CME funding in order to use it to cover this. So CME funding is a big part of that. It's also important to clarify, right out of residency, you have a lot of very expensive exams. For the written boards and the oral boards, also things like DEA license, all state license, all of that stuff. Finding out whether that is something that's covered by the department or out of your CME funding, can have an impact on whether or not you would be able to afford to travel through your CME funding as well. So just also something to think about when it comes to programs. And you also have to think of like cost of living, any place you're going. Is the salary reflective of a different cost of living um, as well? Something that was important to me when I was looking was I had done the income-based repayment plan through residency. And so I wanted to make sure I was going to a institution that could do that I would be eligible for a PSLF through. A lot of the institutions that are doing fellowships are, because most hospitals or most of these institutions are universities or have a nonprofit status, like state university or nonprofit status. But that is something to confirm, just because that can be very expensive financially. Uh, it's a big point for that. Uh, One thing I also want to mention from a fellowship director's perspective, one of our biggest uh, kind of questions is we want to make sure any fellow we hire is also good clinically. So this is something where that's going to be reflected in your letters of recommendation. And it'll often be reflected in conversations we have. Most directors will end up having a phone call with an applicant's program director or somebody else from the program if it's not the director. And so that's just something, a lot of that is to kind of make sure that there's no red flags for clinical work. And so that is why your biggest job as a resident is still to become a good ER doctor. Um, you want to try to get experience with Global EM if are interested in the fellowship. But one of the biggest things is making sure you're going to be good clinically. That's kind of like the absolute requirement. The other thing we tend to look for is both a sign of interest and a sign of some idea of understanding what working in Global EM is like. And that doesn't have to be that you've done a trip every year, like since you started med school. It doesn't have to be like that. It has to be something where you've had a trip at some point, or worked on a project where you can kind of get an idea of some of the logistical challenges, of doing Global EM work. Um, Mainly because we also want to make sure that you're going to have a good time. Like you're going to have a good experience, like doing fellowship with us. And we also want to make sure that we can do what you want. Like if you are interested in a humanitarian response, then my fellowship is not the right one for you. And so I want to make sure that any fellow I have is going to get the training that they need in order to have the career that they want. That's a big part of our job as fellowship directors, with us. Another thing, kind of thinking more about the pros and cons of fellowship. One of the biggest benefits of fellowship is networking, and meeting different people, in the global EM arena. Like Priya mentioned, this is a pretty small world. It's something where there's every time we're at something like a big conference like ASAP or SAM, there's a happy hour, that ends up being a lot of the same people, both at ASAP, SAM. The Consortium of Universities for Global Health has an annual conference that also has a lot of the same people that overlap. The International Conference of Emergency Medicine, same thing. Like this is something where it's a pretty small world. And so a lot of fellowship is making those contacts so that you can then do projects that aren't just at your institution. You usually want to try to have some collaborations outside, at some point. Um, and I think that's a big part of fellowship. That's also not something that's easy to get in a lot of the other global experiences. So a lot of people will ask me about doing something like Doctors Without Borders versus a fellowship. Doctors Without Borders is a great clinical experience, but it's not necessarily going to get you contacts in academic global emergency medicine in order to have a career as a global EM physician. Um, I know a lot of doctors that actually do community EM, and then do MSF, the Doctors Without Borders. But they're not necessarily doing global EM all the time. They're basically doing individual trips, for that. So that's one of the things that's different, I think, between kind of the MSF type, and then the fellowship type.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. That was the one of the deciding factors for me when I was thinking about doing fellowship is that being able to get the type of career that I want straight out of fellowship, being able to develop the global EM network straight out of residency. These are things that, yeah, maybe I could have done that not doing the fellowship, but it would have taken a lot more time, a lot more, um, like individual work to get myself there over probably a period of years versus doing the fellowship. All of those resources and connections are immediately available to you. And it definitely has changed the trajectory of my career by doing the fellowship. So if those are things that are very important to you, those are definite pros of doing the fellowship, and outweigh the cons.
Yeah. I think um I think the biggest con of fellowship is probably the salary. Honestly, like when you compare the salary of a fellow to the salary of a community physician straight out of residency, you make a lot less money as a fellow. Um, the reason you get paid less is because you're also getting a lot of protected time from the department that you're in. So a full-time full-time ER doc at my institution would be doing 14 shifts a month. You're doing 8 shifts a month as a fellow. And you also get things like for schedule, like you're actually like one of the highest people to get the schedule requests. You get a lot of like if you have a class, you will basically you can just say, I have a class, I can't work these times. And that just gets blocked off on your schedule. Um, there's there's also a lot of kind of each institution will have a different version of this, but institutions will also dedicate resources to their fellows for things like extra research support potentially. There's a lot more mentorship opportunities for fellowship, not just with your fellowship directors, but also other people within the department and potentially at the institution as a whole, depending on what you're interested in. So there's a lot of um, kind of support you get as a fellow that you really aren't going to get in any other way. Um, it's also fellowship is one of the few times where you're going to be able to focus on something you're just interested in, just for the sake of being interested in it, without thinking about like, am I going to get a grant out of this? Is this public is something I need to publish? Is this something that like I need to make a career out of? Fellowship is a time for you to be like, okay, I know I'm interested in med ed and global EM, but I don't really know if I want to do like a humanitarian or disaster response. Like, and so maybe I can do course on that and see if that I find that more appealing. Um, it's really hard to get that kind of protected time outside of fellowship. Once you're full-time, either faculty or a community position, you just won't have that much time to do that kind of thing. So that protected time is like one of the other big pros of fellowship. I think another con of fellowship though is that you're also like you're more self-directed than you were as a resident by a lot. But there are still some things that you often just have to do as a fellow that that you may be interested in, but it may not be your first choice of things. So, for instance, like we have like a research forum for fellows that all of our fellows are expected to go to, whether or not they're going to have a significant research career. But our institution has decided that they want the fellows to have a good understanding of how to do research, so that they can do even the more non-traditional research like med ed, like my type of research. I don't really do a lot of big clinical trial. That's not my jam at all. But that's the kind of thing that you may still have some requirements like that as a fellow that um, wouldn't be there as a faculty. But I will definitely say those kind of things are so much less than as a resident. Like as a resident, there were a lot of those type of things that does not happen nearly as much as a fellow.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like fellowship has been more self-directed. There are still things that you just have to do as a part of the fellowship, but definitely more self-directed. And I think that, like potential wages or the time spent in fellowship or lost in doing a fellowship is definitely the protected time is definitely an investment towards your future in a career in global emergency medicine.
Yeah. Another thing to consider is if you are interested in academics, it can be really hard to get a job in an academic department without a fellowship or a PhD. And a fellowship is definitely less of a time requirement than a PhD would be. Um, but a lot of academic chairs want to hire somebody who has experience and some training in their academic area of interest. And fellowship is one of the easiest ways to prove that, to kind of show that you have that kind of experience and knowledge to do that. Um, a lot of chairs are also maybe interested in starting a global EM fellowship. And now you almost need to be a fellowship graduate in order to become a director. at a new site. Like if you want to start a Global EM fellowship somewhere, most chairs are going to want you to have done a fellowship or have done a very significant time abroad for that. Trying to think of any big other pros and cons for fellowship. I think those are the biggest ones.
Yeah, I agree. I think we covered a lot.
Yeah, we did. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now and show you some of these resources that I think are going to be really helpful. Just a second. All right. So this first one, let me scroll up. The URL is sam.org at GMFC. And so this is the site for all fellowship applications for this. And so applications are actually submitted through this website. And it also includes information on the different fellowships. So this link down here shows you what fellowship programs are available around the US and Canada. And so each fellowship that's part of the consortium basically has like a little bit on here. And then with Learn More, you can see their blurb, like what they have chosen to put on this website. And then it also links to their institutional website as well. And so this covers like all of the fellowships for this. The other link here is different fellowships, projects that are ongoing around the world. I think fellowships often update these like this kind of a map every couple of years. I don't know that this is always like super up to date. The time it's most up to date is usually kind of late spring, summer as we're getting ready for applications. So that's something to kind of keep in mind that if you're looking at this in like January, it may not reflect like a project that got started, say, in October. Sometimes that might not get updated. This is the different instructions for how to do the application. And then this is how you get to the application portal. There's actually a webinar, sorry, on this, on how to do the application. So if this is something that if you're wanting to think about how to actually apply, like the actual steps of applying, this actually goes through the nuts and bolts of it. The application portal that I just showed, like that site, got started, I want to say 2 years ago. We've gone through 2 cycles of it now. So I don't think Priya used it. She had a different process for this.
She did.
And so, yeah. And so when we switched to this, Megan, who is the chair of the fellowship consortium before me, made a webinar to kind of discuss how to do the application. I will say it's also something as a fellowship director, if you submit your application on this, it's a good idea to email the contact person that's listed on the SCAM GMFC website to confirm that they got it, just to make sure that they have all the pieces and all of that. And then we also have another webinar about what Global EM fellowships are like. So this is a panel discussion that basically talks about what some of the same things we just covered very briefly here. So like what a fellowship is like, what it does for you, kind of different perspectives on that. And then going back to this website, this includes the application dates. So the way that you apply to Global EM Fellowship is you submit your application through the application portal, and then you also have to register for the match. So Global EM participates in a match. It's a different timeline than the resident match. And that timeline unfortunately changes every year. And so on this website is where we keep the date that the match list opens, like the match system opens, when you can start ranking programs, and then deadline for changing your rank list. So this past year, that was October 16th, and then match day was October 30th. This year was much earlier than usual. Usually it's about like 2 weeks later than this. Um, and so I don't know what it's going to be in the coming years. This is something, these dates are set by the NRMP. So our fellowship doesn't really get much of a say. One thing you might notice is with the dates of this, this is often right around, or the rank list due date is often right around or after ASAP as one of the big national conferences. That means that a lot of fellowship directors will go to ASAP and have in-person interviews, often at a coffee shop or something like that. And so the things that you'll end up needing for your application will include letters of recommendation, an essay, a CV, and like I said, you're basically trying to get so that you have thought about this as a career and can say why you're interested in it. The things about like clinical care, like all that stuff, that's usually going to come out of your letters of rec. Like you don't really need to talk to too much about that part. That's really going to be a lot more about letters, like what your program director often will say for that. Once you submit the application, then you usually get contacted by either the coordinator or the fellowship director to set up an interview or to say whether or not you're eligible for interview. And so as part of that initial application, they might be looking to make sure that there's like the minimum requirements. So for like Stanford, it's that you have 4 years of either resident time or EM experience for that. And so we'll kind of make sure of that before we go through the interview process. Um, we do the interview. We often will talk to a program director at some point or somebody else. Sometimes it might just be that we know the person that's writing you a letter, and even if it's not your PD, we might reach out to them. And then you go to match day. And match day is very much like what it was as a resident, where you basically just find out at exactly what time the match happens. You just see what your results are. So I hope that kind of explains a little bit more about how the application process works. The webinar about the application is definitely really helpful for going through the steps of it. Okay. Any other last thoughts, Priya?
That was great.
Yeah, it's something I am going to apologize. I am post night shift, so I tend to get a little wordy. But I think those websites, playing around on those websites and looking at those webinars, I think if you're trying to decide if fellowship is right for you, or if you have decided and you want to be one of us, then uh, looking at that application webinar is also really helpful. All right. I will make sure that you guys get our email addresses as part of this when you get the video. So please definitely feel free to email us if any questions.
Yes, please reach out if you have any questions. Happy to answer anything from a fellow's perspective.
Yeah. And like I said, I'm one of the fellowship co-directors, but I am very used to getting emails from people who are like, I don't think I can come to your program, but I still want to talk about what I should be looking for and like what I'm interested in, what I should think about with this. I've definitely had multiple of those kind of conversations with people from 3-year programs who know they aren't coming to me as a fellow, but still happy to chat about that. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop recording. Have a nice day, everybody.